Into the scripture. We were between chapters 3 and 4, the Gospel of John. There are a couple things kind of left hanging from last week, but I forgot to ask if there are any news updates or any announcements that need to be made for the good of the whole. Okay, check that one off the list. In way of a couple things, Tom was going to do some homework for us. Did you do the homework?
I attempted to, and the problem is I don't recall. If you remember from last week, I remember hearing years ago somebody told me that when they were translating, this is probably back in King James days.
Right.
Or Geneva Bible days even, I don't know. I mean, we're going back, that the word belief was made from two Anglo-Saxon words. Be, to live, is to
Yes.
be.
Yes.
And then I thought it was leafing, but I couldn't find anything which meant in accordance with, so it would be to live in accordance with.
That makes good sense.
But I can't verify that, but I don't specifically recall the second part of that compound word either, so that's my problem.
Okay.
But I did attempt to find it, and I can't verify what I said.
I appreciate you doing that, because what's really important to us, because the English as well as other languages are the target language is what they're translated into. But a lot of times you go back years and they had a better sense of which word would capture the meaning. But Randall, after class last week, pointed out that some of his translations at the end of the third chapter did not translate chapter 3, verse 36, did not translate it the way that the New American Standard does. New American Standard says in verse 36, "He who believes in the Son has eternal life, but he who does not obey the Son will not see life, but the wrath of God abides on him." And I was making the comparison how belief is pitted against obedience. Well, some translations actually translate it, does not believe. And so they translate belief on both sides of this. So I went back and looked it up, and guess what? The word used here can be translated either way. So both translations are correct. But I find this fascinating because this word is more often translated obey than it is believe. But regardless of that, we're going to see this clearly. I'm partial to the New American Standard, the way they translate it here. I think the evidence leans in that direction. We'll go with obedience instead of just believe. But the point I really was trying to make is, we're going to see later in the Gospel of John, that's exactly the direction John's going to go. Regardless of the words used, he's going to talk about, don't just have mental assent. Does that capture what I'm trying to say? What's another way of saying mental assent?
Enlightenment.
Right. Okay. What I'm trying to get at is believing something that doesn't make any difference to you. It doesn't change your life at all. Just acknowledging, maybe assent, acknowledge that something is true.
Preference, even somewhere you prefer to believe something, you don't necessarily live that way.
Right. And John is really going to attack that idea. That's not enough. In fact, I think the whole Bible attacks that idea. The word that we typically are trying to translate into English is a Greek word pistis, and it's typically translated faith. Sometimes it's translated belief. But this word, which is a rich word, it is a word that means more than just acknowledging, assent, realizing the truthfulness of something. But it's the trusting, it's the impact, it's the living in accordance with. Okay, now I see this, my life will never be the same. Now I get this, so I'm making a change based on that. That's why I think it's totally acceptable to, if the word can be translated either way, to go with obey here, because it fits the overall teaching of what John's going to do. And one of the reasons I don't mind spending a little extra time on this, remember the purpose of his book? These things have been written in order that we might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and believing on him have life in his name. Yes,
There's no gray area here. You choose to believe or you don't. Indecision is like a fatal choice.
Oh man, that's good. That's very good. There's a sense in which there's so many ways to parse that out. I'm glad you said that, because sometimes if you choose not to do anything and be indecisive. You've really chosen not to believe. You really have. Not to do what is asked of you. You can't plead, well, I was thinking about it. Okay. Chapter 4, verse 1, I think we kind of set the stage last week in talking about where the Samaritans are. The Samaritans, I don't mean this in a derogatory way, I'm just trying to say this to give us a flavor. Half-breed, that sounds derogatory though. That's not acceptable in 2019. Let me try to think of a better word here. Multicultural. Maybe that's the word I need to say. We've got a multicultural ethnic group here. They're not strictly Jews. Yeah, we did this on purpose, Randall, just to mess you up.
Okay.
Where you're going to sit. So anyway, the Samaritans are partially Jewish, but they have intermarried with other races. One of the points I was trying to make last week is that in and of itself a problem to marry somebody of another race? No. What is the problem that the Bible focuses on?
Their beliefs.
Their beliefs. Their beliefs. Their faith. Using faith in the sense of body of belief, what you believe about God or other gods. And intermarrying with people of other faiths and accepting, they can be the exact same race. Everything can be the same. But if it's a different belief system, that's a problem. And even the New Testament talks about being unequally yoked. And in that very passage, 2 Corinthians chapter 6, where it talks about being unequally yoked, it specifically says, what do believers have in common with unbelievers? So it's very much talking about faith issues. Why am I want to be clear on this, but as an older preacher now, I can't tell you the number of times I've heard people bring this up, and I'll go back to the first time I remember this. As a young preacher, I remember a young lady who, with her little kids, would come to church every week, and I didn't know at first, and found out later she was married. Her husband never came to church. Went to visit and everything. Nice enough guy. Didn't believe in God. Didn't believe in anything. And so eventually we, got a little closer to her, and I'm like, you were brought up in church. Yeah, I was brought up in church. And so I guess I was brave enough to ask the question, why in the world did you marry a guy like that? And she said, nobody ever told me. And I'm thinking, well, ignorance is not an excuse. You should have checked this out on your own. But I'm sorry, maybe it's just the way I've been brought up. That'd be your fault. but seriously, the more you're in church and the more you're into this, as far as trying to live your life for God, I really can't understand how people don't see that that's going to be a problem. If you as an individual have identified that the most important thing for you to do is live for God, how can you not see that marrying somebody else who doesn't care about that is going to be an issue in your marriage? Maybe I'm overstating the point, but it seems to me that's the point the Bible's making. And so the issue here is one of faith. It's not so much nationality. So we're going to be dealing with Samaritans, but it's an issue of faith. And that's the point of John's book, right? To better explain to us what faith and belief is all about. So without further ado, let's finally get into this 4th chapter. Therefore, when the Lord knew, chapter 4, verse 1, therefore when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, parenthetically, although Jesus himself was not baptizing, but his disciples were. Why do you think he threw that in?
Right. Anybody could say they were baptized by Jesus.
Yeah, would anybody ever say that? Do you think anybody would ever say that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, which church in the New Testament had a real problem with this?
Corinthians.
Yeah, the church of Bourne. Yeah, they were constantly talking about who baptized him and whose disciple they were, and as though that made them better than somebody else. And Apostle Paul has to deal with that in the 1st chapter and the 3rd chapter of 1 Corinthians. So he points that out. But the point he's making here in the first verse is the Pharisees here, he's baptizing. Okay, what did the Pharisees think about John baptizing a bunch of people?
They didn't seem very happy.
That really bothered them. Why is he baptizing? So when the news gets out that Jesus' disciples are making and baptizing more disciples than John, the New Testament says, it uses a word, and obviously it's superlative here, but it uses a word as saying that everybody came out to be baptized with John. But Jesus' disciples were baptizing more than John. This is heaping superlative on superlative. It's making the point the only people that we know weren't baptized by John or Jesus' disciples were Pharisees, religious leaders. And that's Luke 7:29 and 30. And it's there that it makes a comment they were showing that they did not accept God's will for them, and they showed that, they displayed that by not being baptized by John. Right? Okay. Again, why am I emphasizing this? Because people automatically assume that when Jesus was talking to this guy who was crucified next to him, that guy next to him had never been baptized. The whole issue is a moot point. But before we get to the fact that it's a moot point, why would you assume, this is kind of like the presumption of atheism, isn't it? Why would you presume this guy had never been baptized? If the New Testament author said that John was baptizing everybody, and Jesus' disciples baptized more than John.
They should ask him if he was a Pharisee.
That would make him a Pharisee. If he wasn't
Yeah.
baptized. You're right.
That's a very good point, yeah. And they probably would have mentioned something if he was a Pharisee. Okay, why is it a moot point?
Old covenant.
It's Old Covenant. When does the New Covenant take effect?
After Jesus died.
After Jesus died. That's Hebrews chapter 9. So anything that happened before Jesus' death is technically, by biblical definition, a will is not into effect till the death of the one who made it. So by the Bible's own definition, that's under the Old Covenant. Verse 3, so the news is out that Jesus and his disciples are baptizing more. Because of that, that's the backdrop for verse 3. He left Judea and went away again into Galilee. Judea would be where the southern kingdom was in the Old Testament times, that deep down around Jerusalem. On the other side of Samaria, in between Judea and Galilee, that's Samaria. On the other side, that's the area that Jesus is going to. Before we get to his trip, why is he leaving? It says, news gets out with the religious leaders that he's baptizing more, so he leaves. What's the connecting thought here? Why is he leaving? Because of the news of the baptism.
It's not his time yet.
It's not his time yet, which implies that if he would have stayed there, it would have brought things to an end a little quicker, maybe? And why would it have brought things to an end a little quicker? Well, because he's baptizing. Well, why would baptizing bring things to an end a little quicker?
Wouldn't he end up under the Pharisees were going to start scrutinizing everything he's doing? And the confrontation that obviously would happen, because we've seen the confrontations later that did happen. So,
And what was the probably one or two of the biggest reasons that they put on the table? What was it that Jesus was constantly doing that really upset them? Sabbath day. Goes against their laws and what they thought should be. So I think it shows confrontation of power struggle. They felt like it was being taken away from them. In fact, the high priest at that time is going to make a statement before Jesus' death. He says, don't you understand it's better than one guy died than we lose all the people? And he didn't even realize that he was being prophetic when he said that. But what he was saying is, it's okay for us to falsely accuse, put this guy to death as long as we stay in power. So it was very much a power issue, and it seems to me that they viewed baptism as an affront to their power. Because people were actually admitting that, no, I've got to repent. I've got to change. The way I've been living is not right. Okay, that's the backdrop. And so it says in verse 4, and he had to pass through Samaria. Well, for us, that makes sense, because going from Judea, you go straight north to Galilee, you're going to pass through Samaria. But what was the common practice of the day? They go around. Added an extra day to their journey. Common practice of a Jew in Jesus' day was cross over the Jordan River to go up on the other side. And by the way, what's the word that means the other side? Perea, thank you. They go to the other side, and they travel up the other side, and then they cross back over the Jordan River again when they got up to the area of Galilee, just so they didn't have to step foot in Samaria. Okay, that was common practice, but it says here, had to. Had to. Well, you could respond by saying, no, he didn't. Didn't have to. Until you get a little bit further into the story. What is it that's have to for Jesus? What does Jesus have to do?
God's will.
Exactly. Has to do, my food is to do the will of the Father. That's the have to for him. So it's not a physical have to per se. It's a spiritual, want to please God. Therefore, that does have an impact on the way I'm going to live physically. Great example here, verse 5. So he came to the city of Samaria called Sychar, near the parcel of ground that Jacob gave his son Joseph. If you find this on a map, Sychar is located very close to a mountain. There are two famous mountains in this area of Samaria, and they're famous mountains because when they first entered into the Promised Land, back before this was their territory, who was the guy who led them into the Promised Land? Moses wasn't allowed in the Promised Land, so who was it? It'd be Joshua. They enter into the middle of the Promised Land. So they're going to cross the Jordan River, come dead center, and they're going to divide and conquer. That's the way they took the Promised Land. But when they first cross over, they come to these two mountains that are close enough that if somebody stands on one mountain and yells out, you can hear the person on the other mountain. Very significant because they have half the people stand on one mountain, the other half the people stand on the other mountain. And what do?
One says blessings, the other one says curse.
Yeah. We obey God, life's going to be good. Amen. People on the other side, we disobey God, life's going to be bad. Amen, right? Okay, which one's which? Well, the two mountains are named Ebal.
Which I like, it sounds like evil.
Okay, so that's the bad one. That's right. And what's the other one close to this? Gerizim. Gerizim. Just a footnote here, and I've already told you that I am a Hebrew survivor, right? I'm not. I had Hebrew, but boy, you don't want to trust me for you. But one of the things I did learn from my Hebrew professor was I am. Sometimes in English we pronounce that im, but from Hebrew, pronounce it im. Just, it's a plural, it's a way of making things plural. It's just a lot easier when you start reading some of these things in the Old Testament because you'll be embarrassed if you don't pronounce it im. So just pronounce it im. You'll make me happy, okay? Sorry. Okay, so Gerizim, that's the mountain it's close to. Okay, one of the things that's important too. Did the Samaritans come down to Jerusalem to worship?
No.
Where did they go to worship?
One of the mountains.
Which mountain?
That'd be Gerizim.
That's right, Gerizim. They built a temple there. That's the place where they had their worship center as far as the Samaritans were concerned. Okay, verse 6, and Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, being wearied from his journey, was sitting thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour. Okay, I think there's some very significant things there, but before we get to the significant things, this is kind of neat to me. How many of you in this room have been to Jacob's well? Have you been to Jacob's well? Yeah. I just find it fascinating because this is one of those sites that if you really, really, really want to stand and sit where Jesus sat, all you have to do is sit all the way around this well. And you've got yourself covered because you know this is one of the places where Jesus was, okay? The other thing, I'm sorry, this is just a little footnote, shouldn't even be on the video, but to me it's kind of fascinating. I always picture wells with the every well I've seen, you know, they built this thing over the top, right? And they have a little pulley and stuff like that. Well, one of the fascinating things, I have not been to Jacob's well, I've just seen pictures, but you know what they've got? They've got these grooves in the side. Do you remember the grooves in the side? Because they didn't have. You know, I always think you had a pulley, didn't you? No, they didn't. They had a well. So they threw a rope in there and they would pull it up, and it had been used so long that it had cut away into the stone. You can literally see those. Okay, that's just an aside. I just find that kind of stuff fascinating. This is the place where he was, and he says he's sitting by the well. And what time is it?
Sixth hour.
Yeah, 6th hour, if we're by Jewish time, remember we already talked about this? Jewish time, longest day of the year, shortest day of the year had the same amount of hours in it. It was always 12-hour system. So high noon was always the 6th hour, right? Easy way to tell time, the Jewish time. So the 6th hour would be noon. Why is that significant? Well, what happens in the next verse? There came a woman of Samaria to draw water. Okay, before we finish that verse, how many women came out? Identifies one woman. Usually, practice, especially in this period of time, the women would all come together. It'd be a social time. And what time would they come to get the water?
Morning.
Doesn't that make sense? Don't you need water to do everything? How can you make your coffee in the morning if you don't have your water? Right? Anyway, yeah. They would draw the water in the morning. So this woman coming by herself, anybody reading this in early centuries, that'd be a red flag. Coming at noon, they would catch that. Hey, there's something definitely wrong here, right? Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. So this kind of sets the stage. Jesus was tired. He's hungry. Disciples have gone to buy food. And this woman comes out when no other women are coming out to the well. And Jesus strikes up a conversation with her. Therefore the Samaritan woman said to him, this verse 9, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask me for a drink since I am a Samaritan woman?" Okay, each one of these verses, I think it's very important to note what John's doing. He's developing the story for us. Because reading this verse, it sounds like, oh, this must have not taken place all the time, right? And so what do we know? Number one, Samaritans and Jews probably didn't strike up conversations. Not easily. Most Jews avoided Samaria when they're traveling in that area. They avoided that area. So between a Jew and a Samaritan, that'd be an issue. Man and a woman. You spoke to a woman if you were married to her or related to her, but it was not common practice, especially in public. In fact, have we talked about the bruised and bleeding Pharisees before? A sect of the Pharisees. They felt more righteous than the other Pharisees because every time they saw a woman in public, they would close their eyes. Even if they were climbing a ladder or walking along the edge of a roof or whatever, they would close their eyes. And so they would crash into walls and they would have all sorts of bruises and they would brag about them. They would say, "See that one right there? Yeah, a woman came out of, she came out of the, out of the alley and boy, I closed my eyes, or whatever." It was like a badge of honor to them. Well, that overstates the point, but it kind of makes the point. Women and men talking, Samaritan woman, and the kind of woman that would come out by herself at noon is probably not a woman of great reputation, and just about anybody probably would have picked up on that in that day because she's by herself. It's the middle of the day. Yeah.
You know how she knew he was a Jew? I'm just kind of curious. 'Cause maybe it's because of the way he spoke or something.
Thank you, that passed through my mind.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because I don't have an answer. But I did. You make me pause long enough to say those are the points that I want to get. I don't know how she knew he was a Jew. There may be some extra stuff here. But the guys who really know Greek well say that to really get the flavor of this, you ought to picture this woman saying, "Yeah, you Jews have nothing to do with this, but when you're thirsty, hey, now you're ready to talk to us." Right? A little bit of animosity. That's a great word. I'm grasping for words tonight. It's not coming to me, but yeah, it's kind of like she's not being real nice here. This is not a simply the words spoken, inquired, "Why are you talking to me?" No, it's kind of like a, "Hey, it's because you want some drink." How does she know he's a Jew? If this weren't Jesus, there would be several things that might be the case, because Jews did distinguish themselves by the way they dressed. And one of the things we're going to find over in the 6th chapter that I find very interesting is in the 6th chapter, Jesus feeds 5,000. And when he feeds 5,000, do you remember how much is left over? 12 baskets full of food, full of bread. It says the bread, right? Where'd they get the baskets? Nobody had food, but where'd they get the baskets? Why am I bringing this up now? Because one of the distinguishing factors of Jews when they went on trips, they almost always carried a backpack-sized basket. Why? Because if you're traveling, and especially if it's time for a feast, you didn't want to become ceremonially unclean. You could become ceremonially unclean by eating certain food you're not supposed to eat. So you pack your own food. So it's not a surprise at all that Jews would have baskets. The thing that's surprising is nobody had any food in the baskets. That's just a shocking thing. Okay. But it's a distinguishing factor of Jews in the way they travel.
Could it be
Other
an
than that, I'd
accent?
just be making guesses. Yes.
Could it be an accent?
You know what?
Around here, some
Thank
from
you.
Georgia, some from California. North
Well,
Carolina. You
Who do
can't
we
tell where
know
they're
in
from.
New Testament times had an accent? Who do we know?
Jesus.
Which area had the accent?
Galilee.
Galilee.
The hill
How do we know that they had the accent? Because it specifically talks about when they spoke. He spoke like a Galilean. So they had some sort of accent. And yes, we do associate it with the...
Backwoods.
Yeah. We're not allowed to say things like that anymore, Greg.
Don't say real many.
We have to be very careful about that. Just spoke differently.
There you go.
Put out his pinky when he was trying to walk. Anyway, she identifies, she knows he's a Jew, and she makes this comment, and she's probably being a little antagonistic. The first back and forth. It's interesting, though, that Jesus uses this, because this is going to be a great metaphor for the message. Water, bread, both of them are going to work in this context. Bread with his disciples, water with her. Can you live without bread and water? Bread meaning food. Can you live without food and water? Not for very long. Not for very long. It's refreshing. It quenches a thirst. It's essential for life. Great metaphor for the very things that he wants to teach her about what you really need in your life. Your relationship with God. So he starts off with, which by the way makes me think, takes an everyday life thing and he's going to turn it into an opportunity to talk about God. If I didn't, I'm sure Seth did. In talking about this guy named Roy Weiss. Roy Weiss, at his funeral, they said based on his daily journals, they calculated he had baptized 5,000 people? 10,000 people in his lifetime. One guy. That's baptizing a lot of people. Anyway, he was constantly meeting people and people he never met before. Sometimes, it took him a while, but other times he was just constantly able to lead into conversations, serious conversations about the Lord. In one story I remember, he's visiting somebody in the hospital. And great opportunity, by the way, talking to somebody in the hospital, because when somebody's in the hospital, usually they're in a condition to listen. Number one, they can't run away. Number two, sometimes they're contemplating their own, I might not be around that long, all that stuff. But he's in the hospital to visit. He's visiting the hospital to visit somebody in the hospital. But on the way up, he gets in the elevator and somebody else gets in the elevator and he's standing closer to the buttons. And he looks at the person and he says, "Going up?" And they said, "Yep." And you know what? Number or whatever. Well, he happens to get on the elevator with the same person after the visit. They happen to get on the elevator at the same time. He says, "Going down?" And when the doors close, he says, "That's interesting. When you die, are you going up or are you going down?" And he just led that into a conversation where he asked him about, "Are you a Christian? Do you know the Lord?" and stuff. And he just had a way of doing that. Jesus is going to use everyday life stuff, drinking water. He uses it as a great opportunity to talk about that which really satisfies not just your physical body, but the thirst of your soul. Okay, so John includes this editorial comment at the end of verse 9. For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. John's going to do this a few times. He's going to explain some things that maybe people who don't live in that area don't know. Because John is not targeted to the Jews like Matthew is, He's not targeted to the Romans like Mark tends to be. He's more cosmopolitan. He's more wants to catch everybody. And so he explains some of these things throughout his gospel. Okay, verse 10. Jesus answered and said to her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that says to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. The word for living here, by the way, is zoe. If the other word for life or living is bios, from which we get biology, the study of life. It just means being alive. This is not the word for being alive. This is the word zoe, which means experiencing what life is meant to be. If we said, now that's really living, you would use the Greek word zoe. Real life, right?
High life.
Full of meaning. Say what?
High life?
Okay. Sorry. I don't know about that. Okay, but before we comment on this, tie it in with what the Samaritan woman just said. The Samaritan woman was kind of antagonistic to him. He's kind of like saying, oh no, don't walk away from this conversation. This is really important. If you only knew, this is something you would really want. She says in verse 11, she said to him, sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? Okay, you could either say, and it would be accurate to say, that she doesn't really get what Jesus is doing yet. Okay, and that is accurate. But I actually think this is where the conversation starts. Because at first, it's more like she doesn't want to talk. And then Jesus says, coming back, he's not going to let this conversation go. So she kind of, I think at this point, she's kind of like saying, wait a minute here, you don't have anything to draw water with. What are we talking about? Kind of like, her asking a question. And so he's going to respond to that. Oh, well, I haven't finished saying what she's going to say. Where do you get this living water? But in verse 12, she's still speaking. He says, you are not greater than our father Jacob, are you, who gave us this well and drank of it himself and his sons and his cattle. This almost sounds like she's still a little bit offended, doesn't it? She's not over the Samaritan versus Jew thing here. And Jesus answered and said to her, everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him shall never thirst. But the water that I will give him will become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life. Okay, he is, especially when he gets into the verse 14. If she's following, she's going to say, I'm not talking about physical water, because I'm talking about something that can give you eternal life. Right? But the woman said to him in verse 15, sir, give me this water, so I will not be thirsty, nor come all the way here to draw. Okay, I'm not thinking she's really captured the spiritual element of this yet. Because she's thinking maybe this is something magical, mystical. She still hasn't gotten it, but Jesus, by the way, has Jesus ever said something before that he knew people weren't going to understand? Does Jesus do that very often? About half the time. he's pretty much saying stuff, and when people start to catch what he says, instead of, okay, that's great, he raises the bar. And we're really going to see that over in the 6th chapter. But he's going to challenge her to think. In fact, he's going to challenge her to be thirsty for this. Is this something you really want? He said to her, go and call your husband and come here. Okay, I agree with the people who say Jesus is not changing the subject. Some people look at this passage and say, okay, Jesus stops talking about the water and he goes on and talks about something else. No. I think what Jesus is doing here is really trying to get her to see, I'm not talking about physical water that meets a physical thirst. I'm talking about the thirst of your soul, what you really want in life. And for her, it's going to become pretty obvious she's been looking for meaning in relationships. Some people, I think the modern day example of this would be somebody who said, if I can just find Mr. or Mrs. Right, the right person, I'll be happy and everything will be okay and life will be good. Okay, a good marriage, a good relationship is a blessing from God. It's very important. But if you think your life is going to be everything it's meant to be, if you get that right person and that's all it takes, you're putting a 10,000-pound weight on a 1,000-pound bridge. It's meant to be a blessing. It is not meant to be your fulfillment in life. That's something only God can do. Okay? So there's a lot of examples of this. For her, it's a relationship. For other people, it's work. For some people, it's just having fun. For some people, it's accomplishment. Or, you know, if I just have people look up to me. A lot of people have this idea, if I could just fill in the blank, I would be a happy person. And I think what he's doing here applies to everybody, because just about everybody has some sort of blank, unless they've caught on early that nothing's going to fulfill me, and it's only God that can fit in that blank. He's the only one who meets the thirst of my soul, right? So when Jesus brings up this idea of her husband, I don't think he's changing the subject. I think he's actually trying to get a little deeper here and say, I'm not just talking about physical water, I'm talking about spiritual issues. Because this is a spiritual issue for the woman. The woman says in verse 17, she answered him, and I think I already told you this, but in the Greek language there's only 3 words here. It's like she doesn't want to talk about this. In fact, the Greek literally says, I know man. I know man. Let's change the subject. Let's talk about something else, right? And the woman answered, I have no husband. Jesus said to her, you have correctly said, I have no husband. For you have had, how many?
5.
5 husbands. And the one whom you now have is not your husband. This you have truly said. Okay, I don't know if this is an issue you're going to run into, but most of my day today was not studying for this or my sermon Sunday, which I really desperately needed to study. I spent most of my day today studying marriage, divorce, and remarriage, because some people have been watching some videos in our church that have been put out by well-intending people, but I really think are not representing the truth. I think they're misrepresenting what God says in His Word about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And one of the things that they were teaching, and the 2 passages are Matthew chapter 5 and Matthew chapter 19, where Jesus talks about, remember they asked him the question, are you allowed to divorce?
For any reason.
Yeah, for any reason. And by the way, they're setting a trap for Jesus. They're not really interested in the truth. They're trying to trick Jesus. Anyway, some people teach that based on what Jesus said, that if you don't, if it's not for a biblical, I don't want to misrepresent what they say, so let me try to word this carefully. At the end of the day, what they are saying is that if you get a divorce and marry somebody else, you're not really married to that other person. You're committing adultery with that other person. In the eyes of God, you're still married to this first person. Okay, there's a lot to be said about that, but I want to point it out in the context here. Why? Because Jesus did not say you were married one time and had 5 affairs, 6 affairs, 5 affairs. He didn't say that, did he?
No.
He said you've had 5 husbands. And this one, you're not married to. So the idea that you only have one marriage and then everything that happens after that, you have a relationship with somebody else, is adultery. Just from this passage is obviously wrong. There's a lot more to what they say, but I didn't want to digress into that. But there's a lot of teaching out there that can really mess people up. That's why I think we really need to know the Word well. So, come back to this story. She's obviously had problems in relationships, right? I think we can catch that. This is what she's been thirsting for, or where she's been looking for meaning in her life. The woman said, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet." Why would she say that?
He doesn't know him and he knows me. Wait a minute.
You know what she's going to say when she goes into Samaria and tells people there to come out and listen to this guy? She's going to say, "Come and listen to this guy who told me everything I ever did." Knows my whole life. Well, that's probably the high points of her whole life right there. Right? So she says, "I perceive that you're a prophet." Verse 20, "Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, And you people say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship, you Jews, right? Okay, now is she changing the subject? I think so. I think so. I think maybe not purposefully. Maybe not purposefully. Maybe she thinks, wow, yeah, he knows everything about my life. Here's somebody I can really ask difficult questions. And you know what? They've been talking about this. This is a big issue. Let me ask him. Let me get the skinny on this, right? Well, maybe that's true. But nonetheless, as far as her need for God, we've been sidetracked here. Sometimes people do it purposefully because they feel pressure. It's kind of like the heat's on. I don't want to talk about this anymore. So sometimes purposefully people change stuff. Other times people don't do it on purpose, but why are we talking about the size of the bass fish when we were talking about, how do we get off on that subject? Okay, I love this because Jesus doesn't reprimand her. He's going to answer her and he's going to bring her right back to where it needs to be, which I think is a great example for us. It's kind of like, if you get in an argument with somebody, that's going nowhere. If you offend somebody, you've lost the opportunity. The goal here is to get people right with God. So let me be nice. Let me try to answer that question. And by the way, let's go back and talk about what's really important here. And gracefully, that's exactly what Jesus is going to do. She brings up this question about where people worship. She's using this worship in the technical sense of bringing sacrifices and expression of worship. First time, I shouldn't say this off the top of my head, but I'm going to go ahead and say it, and you guys check me out if it's wrong. But if I remember correctly, the first time the word worship is used in the Hebrew language, it's talking about giving an offering. Giving an offering. Okay. Worship in the broad sense of the term is our expression, the way we live, and the things we do, or the things we refrain from to please God. It's our life before God. And there's a lot of things we do, bringing the sacrifices, bringing of offerings, assembling together is part of the worship. And that's what she's talking about, is the way the Samaritans worship on this mountain. What's this mountain? Gerizim, right? You people say in Jerusalem. Jesus answered her in verse 21. He said to her, "Woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither this mountain nor Jerusalem will you worship the Father." Okay, he's going to answer her question in a minute, but even in answering her question, he's going to say, hey, there's something a whole lot more important here. Well, I'll go ahead and answer your question. You may think it's a real big deal. It's not as big as you think. But let me go ahead and give you the answer. Here's the answer in verse 22. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know. For salvation is from the Jews. So who's right? Jews. In essence, he says, no, you guys messed up on this one. You didn't base that on anything God said. The Jews did. By the way, when it says salvation is from the Jews, notice this. It does not say salvation is for all the Jews. It didn't say that. It says from. Why is that so important? Because the one who brings salvation is the Messiah. And where's the Messiah come from?
Line of David.
Right. God did select the Jewish people for purposes of service. They're the ones that are going to bring the Messiah into the world. Right.
This is the big contention between the other side that says they're children of Abraham. The Arabs, am I not wrong? I've heard
What's
this
the point of
before,
contention?
that they're the chosen,
Oh.
not
Oh.
you Jews. You know, this whole racial issue.
Yeah. I find that interesting because I only dabble in some of those things. When I go to the missionary convention, I usually sit in on a couple of workshops on Buddhism and Islam. I've given up on Hinduism because my head swims in there. They've got so many gods, even the Hindus don't even know how many gods they have, right? So I stopped going to those workshops. But I try to sit in on these workshops, and the thing that fascinates me, these are not just, usually at ICOM, International Conference on Missions, there are usually people that are experts in different fields, and there's some reason why they're putting on a workshop. But typically, these are guys that used to be leaders in Islam and were converted to Christianity, and they've studied it well, but sometimes even professors that taught in their schools, so they know the subject quite well. One of the points that, in speaking about this, they do make a claim, not Abraham and Sarah, but Abraham and Keturah, right? Am I getting this right? I'm talking about stuff I haven't read. But anyway, from that line and those children, they say that's where the Arab race comes from. And he says, you know what? We've got no documentation for that. It is a claim they make. There's no evidence for it. So, but yeah, you're right. People will say that. Okay. But he's making a distinction between the Samaritans and the Jews, and he's saying the Jews are right on this issue as far as where you're supposed to worship. Do you remember when the kingdom first split? Northern kingdom and southern kingdom? Okay, who's the king in the south? Son of Solomon who split the kingdom? Rehoboam. Remember he's made the statement, my little finger's going to be thicker than my dad's thigh. You know, you thought things were tough under my dad. You haven't seen anything yet. Well, why did he make a statement like that? Whose advice was he following? Yeah, he ignored the advice of the older, wiser. He paid attention to the younger who told him to assert himself. He did and split the kingdom. When he split the kingdom, who's the new king in the north? Jeroboam. What's one of the first things that Jeroboam's concerned about? He said, I'm going to lose my new kingdom because people are going to go to Jerusalem because that's where you're supposed to worship. So he gets 2 calves.
Yeah.
If you're a Jew, can't you figure out you had a problem with a calf before? You know what? God thinks of a golden calf. He sets up 2 calves so that people won't have to go down south to worship. And that was an abomination to God. And the problem started right away with the northern kingdom. Well, should have known better, should have known their lesson from history. But Jesus gets back on task here. He sets this up. Before he answers her question, he says there's an hour coming when neither this mountain nor Jerusalem. Right? So he makes a point that this is not as big a deal as you think it is. He's forecasting the future here. He answers her question, then he comes right back to it in verse 23 and says, but an hour is coming and now is. Not only is it going to be pretty soon, you're seeing it. In fact, you're talking to the person that's going to change this. Hour now is when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For such people, the Father seeks to be His worshipers. There's a lot to this. But first of all, let me ask the question. How do we know? Is there any sign that God gave that maybe everybody should have figured out that, okay, you can stop worshiping at the temple now? Were there any signs that took place? Yeah, you think maybe when the earthquake and the veil of the temple was torn from top to bottom, that maybe some of the priests would, along with all the other signs, such as, I'm sorry, I just cut to the one that always gets me. The one that always gets me, all the dead righteous people coming to life and walk around Jerusalem. I'd like to think that would have an impression on me. I'd like to think I would get that one. But anyway, it's not, what is it that God's looking for? Worship Him in spirit and in truth. What's the problem with translating the word spirit? Should it have a capital letter or not? What's the difference that it makes? Well, we can't tell from the original text, right? Because the oldest ones were all written in capital letters. But if we put a capital letter here instead of a small letter in the English, what are we implying? We're talking about the Holy Spirit. Now, when you use the adjective along with it, but there's no adjective here. It just says in spirit and truth. So is it talking about God's Spirit or is it talking about our spirit? Probably talking about us because he's talking about the way we worship. What does worship mean?
The way we live.
Yeah. The way we live for God. This is an expression of, God, this is for you. My body I'm not living it for myself, I'm living it for you. Great.
It's assumed that because we've been talking about physical worship, that he would have said this to point out that this is not about the physical.
Thank you. I do think that's one of the points he's making. It's not checking off the box. It's not, I went to the temple this morning, so I'm good for the week. It's not any of that stuff. It's, who are you? Why do you do what you do? Is this, to say in spirit and truth, I think another way of saying that partially would be, is it sincere? Is it right? Are you doing it for the right reason? Not just what's right. For with such people, the Father seeks to, for such people, the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. What does this tell us about God? Well, the main point here is God is looking for sincere, true worship, not just outward performance, but is also telling us God does not have a body. God is spirit. Those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. 1 Timothy 6:16. God alone possesses immortality, lives in unapproachable light. So when Moses saw the backside of God, did he really see the backside of God? No, he saw the backside of he saw a partial manifestation of the glory of God. God can take on a form, but that's not God. That's a form that God is using or taking on. We usually refer to it as a theophany, something physical that can be seen to represent the presence of God. Verse 25, the woman said to him, I know that the Messiah is coming. He was called the Christ. Parenthetically, I think that's appropriate. When that one comes, he will declare all things to us. Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. This is pretty clear, isn't it? Isn't he saying, that's me? Has he said that before? No, he's been very guarded. Yes, he's going to make it very clear, but he's going to say it in challenging ways. But here, outside of Jerusalem and Samaria, where he doesn't have to worry about things coming to an end too quickly, boom, right out there clearly. Yes, I am the Messiah. Verse 27, at this point the disciples came, and they were amazed that he had been speaking with a woman, yet no one said to him, what do you seek? Or why do you speak with her? Okay, so they're not getting it, but nobody says anything. Why do you think they're keeping quiet here? Have you ever been in a class and you knew something but you didn't want to say it? Like right now.
Yeah. He's the teacher.
Why do we do that? Why do we keep our mouths shut
He's
sometimes?
the teacher, you don't want to be, what a stupid question. I'm sorry.
That's a good possibility. Maybe they didn't want to be embarrassed. Maybe they knew enough to know that, okay, some of this doesn't seem right, but he's probably got good reasons for this, and we respect him enough. We're just going to keep our mouths shut right now. Or maybe they just didn't want to look silly. I don't know, but they don't say anything yet. So the woman left her water pot and went into the city and said to the men, okay, notice she left her water pot. What was she doing out there? Yeah, water. Yeah. Obviously this had a great impact on her, right? She left the water pot. What does she say in verse 20? Come see a man who told me all the things I've done. This is not the Christ, is he? Does she know he's the Christ? I like the way the woman says this, though. It's not like she's lecturing the men. Hey, listen, I figured this all out. Come out. No, she's like, hey guys, you got to see this, and maybe we're talking about the Messiah here. You know, so I think it's very diplomatic the way she says this to the men of the city of Sychar. They went out of the city and were coming to him. Verse 30 is very important. She runs back into the city. The people of the town are coming out, right? Now, that's the backdrop. Jesus is going to start talking with his disciples. But don't lose the visual here. What's happening over here? The men of the city are coming out to see Jesus. So here's what's going on. Meanwhile, same time, the disciples were urging him, saying, Rabbi, eat. But he said to them, I have food to eat that you do not know about. You know what? I think he's making the exact same point with his disciples that he made with the woman. The woman, he used water, here he's going to use food. What does food do? It sustains you, satisfies hunger, keeps you alive, right? So the disciples were saying to one another, no one brought him anything to eat, did he? Okay, the woman didn't get it when he talked about living water. They're not getting it when he talks about bread. In fact, the one that really gets me is John's going to talk about the feeding of the 5,000. After the feeding of the 5,000, there's feeding of the 4,000. John doesn't talk about that. But in Mark, I think Matthew as well, but in Mark, after the feeding of both the 5,000 and 4,000, when they get in the boat, across the other side of the lake, Jesus has just had a back and forth with the Pharisees, and he turns to his disciples and says, watch out for the yeast, scribes and Pharisees. And they turn to each other and say, what did that mean? Yeah, we didn't bring enough bread. He's upset that we didn't bring bread, right? Yeah, so they have this tendency to kind of miss some of the points that Jesus makes. Okay, at this point, they obviously miss it, just like she did. You know, you don't have anything to draw the water from. That's not what he's talking about. They're focused on, well, did somebody bring him something to eat? And Jesus said to them, he's going to make it clear, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. This is so rich. Is God the one who satisfies? Yes. But how does Jesus say it here? My food is to do the will of him who sent me and accomplish his work. For God to be number one in my life means, what am I doing with my life? What am I accomplishing with my life? Is it stuff that God wants me to do? That means God is preeminent in my life. Do you not say there are yet 4 months and then comes the harvest? Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields that are white for the harvest. If they looked up their eyes, what are they going to say? All these people coming from Samaria, which, by the way, might be kind of a challenge for them. Why? Because they're Samaritans. Yeah. But they still need the gospel too. And I'm going to stop right there because we're out of time. Questions, comments? Wow. We still have a long way to go, but it's rich stuff. There's some just fruit. John's just going to focus on a few stories, and he's going to go into some details that the other gospel writers don't. But I always, going through it, especially this time, I try to keep it in the back of my mind. What does this teach me about belief? Because if that's the main purpose of the book, every one of these stories, it's going to point to Jesus. It's going to tell us something interesting about Jesus, but it's also going to tell us something interesting about faith. What is it here? And I find it interesting. We leave on this note where he's challenging his disciples. He just said, you know what my food is? To do what God wants me to do. And then what does he do to his disciples? He turns to them and says, look, I interpret that in one way to say, you really want to please God? Here's a bunch of people. Here's some people who need to hear about God. Let's work.
Also answers their question about why he was talking.
Yes, yes. Okay, hopefully we'll tie some of these loose strings together next week, and then the second half of the 4th chapter is the royal officials healing at a distance, and the royal official comes to him. So we'll get into that next week. That's it.
Thank you.